What would you do if your husband slapped you in a hospital while carrying his child, and his mistress laughed? This isn't just betrayal. It's about power, justice, and a father's revenge. Stay with me. Like, share, and subscribe. You won't forget this story. The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic, but beneath the sterile brightness of fluorescent lights, the scene that unfolded was anything but clean. It was raw, brutal, and unforgettable. A millionaire in an Armani suit stood at the nurse's station, his jaw tight, his voice rising with arrogance. His pregnant wife, in a pale hospital gown, stood a few feet away, one hand resting protectively on her belly. She looked fragile, vulnerable, a woman who should have been shielded from harm. Instead, she was about to be humiliated in a way that would stain every soul who witnessed it. "Stop making a scene, Evelyn," he barked, his words sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of the ward. "You've embarrassed me enough already." Her lips trembled. Evelyn Grant, 28 years old, was 7 months pregnant. She had come here for a routine checkup, a moment that should have been filled with joy and hope. Instead, her world was crumbling. Her husband, Richard Grant, a millionaire real estate mogul known for his cold ambition, had arrived not to comfort her, but to flaunt his betrayal. And beside him, dressed in designer heels and wearing a smirk that could curdle blood, stood Cassandra Moore, his mistress. The sight alone was devastating, but what happened next turned quiet gasps into horrified silence. Evelyn whispered, "Richard, please, not here, not now." Richard's eyes narrowed, his pride wounded by her plea. Then, in a move so shocking that nurses froze mid-step and a security guard's jaw dropped, he raised his hand and slapped his pregnant wife across the face. The sound cracked through the sterile hall like a gunshot. Evelyn stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with disbelief. Cassandra's laughter rang out, low and cruel. "Oh, Richard, she's so dramatic," she purred, as if the humiliation of a pregnant woman was nothing more than theater for her amusement. Every witness, patients in wheelchairs, doctors carrying clipboards, families waiting for loved ones, sat in stunned silence. No one had expected a millionaire to strike his own wife, especially in a hospital, especially when she was carrying his child. It wasn't just a slap. It was a declaration of power, a statement that he thought money and status placed him above morality, above compassion, above consequences. But little did Richard know, this moment of arrogance would ignite a chain reaction that would destroy everything he had built. Because Evelyn wasn't alone. She wasn't just a pregnant wife. She was the daughter of Charles Grant, one of the most feared and respected CEOs in the corporate world. A man whose influence stretched across courtrooms, boardrooms, and governments. And when Charles discovered how his daughter had been treated, no amount of Richard's wealth or arrogance would save him. For now, though, Evelyn stood trembling in that hospital corridor, tears threatening to spill. Her cheek burned from the slap, but the greater pain was in her chest. The betrayal, the humiliation, the knowledge that the man she had once trusted with her heart had chosen to break it in public. "Richard," she whispered again, her voice shaking, "how could you?" He sneered. "You're weak, Evelyn. Always have been. Maybe now you'll learn your place." Cassandra leaned in close, her perfume cloying in the sterile air, and whispered loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll take good care of him while you focus on that baby, if he even wants it." Her laugh was like nails on glass. The bystanders shifted uncomfortably, some whispering, others recording discreetly on their phones. Scandal had a way of spreading faster than fire, and already Richard had lit the spark. He didn't care. In his mind, Evelyn was powerless. What could a pregnant woman do against a millionaire who controlled skyscrapers and spoke the language of contracts and money? But Richard had underestimated the one truth that would bring about his downfall. Evelyn's bloodline. She would leave this hospital shaken, yes, but not broken. Behind her stood a father whose love was as fierce as his influence. And once Charles Grant discovered that his daughter had been publicly slapped while carrying his grandchild, Richard Grant's empire would face a reckoning so complete, so merciless, that it would make the slap look like a whisper in comparison. The witnesses in the hospital didn't know it yet, but they had just seen the opening act of a scandal that would explode across headlines, shatter reputations, and end with the courtroom humiliation of a man who thought he was untouchable. And Evelyn, the woman who had been struck down in front of strangers, would rise again, not just as a wife betrayed, but as a mother, a daughter, and ultimately as the woman who stood tall while her millionaire husband crumbled to dust. What no one expected, not even Evelyn herself, was how quickly the tables would turn. Before the slap, before the shame that echoed through the hospital corridor, Evelyn Grant had once believed in love. She wasn't born into poverty, but she wasn't raised in luxury either. She lived in the quiet balance between modest comfort and hidden privilege. The daughter of Charles Grant, CEO of Grant Global Industries, a name that carried weight across continents. But Evelyn never flaunted her father's wealth. From a young age, she longed to live like an ordinary girl, to experience friendships, romance, and career ambitions without her last name overshadowing everything. At 28, Evelyn had carved out a simple, yet fulfilling life. She worked as a children's literature editor at a mid-sized publishing house in Boston. She adored stories, the ones that made children laugh, that filled their dreams with courage and hope. In her small office lined with colorful illustrations and stacks of manuscripts, Evelyn found joy in nurturing the voices of young authors. Her co-workers knew her as kind, humble, and endlessly patient, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and brought in homemade cookies during deadlines. But behind her warmth, Evelyn carried a quiet vulnerability. Her mother had died when she was only 14, leaving her with a father who loved her fiercely, but often expressed it in stern, businesslike ways. Charles Grant was a man of towering presence, a strategist who could crush corporate rivals with a single boardroom maneuver. But at home, he was awkward with tenderness. He didn't always know how to comfort a grieving teenager. So Evelyn grew up learning to comfort herself, leaning into books, into stories where women found strength in their darkest hours. She dreamed of building a family where love was abundant and gentle, the kind she had missed after her mother's passing. And when Richard Grant entered her life, she thought her dream had come true. Richard was handsome, magnetic, and determined. He wasn't related to her family despite sharing the same last name. It was coincidence, or maybe fate. He came from modest roots and carried himself like a man who had clawed his way into success. Evelyn first met him at a charity event hosted by her publishing house. He had just closed a massive deal in real estate, and his confidence filled every corner of the room. When his eyes fell on her, he didn't see the CEO's daughter. He saw Evelyn, the graceful editor, in a modest navy dress, sipping sparkling water with quiet dignity. He courted her with charm and persistence, flowers delivered to her office, late-night phone calls where he asked about her favorite childhood books, walks along the Charles River where he promised her a life filled with laughter, adventure, and security. For the first time, Evelyn felt truly seen, not as Charles Grant's daughter, but as herself. She ignored the faint warnings whispered by friends who found Richard's ambition a little too sharp, his charm a little too rehearsed. Love, she thought, demanded faith. Within a year, they married. The wedding was elegant but not extravagant at Evelyn's request. She wanted intimacy, not spectacle. Richard smiled at her that day with what seemed like pure devotion, slipping a ring onto her finger with trembling hands. Evelyn believed, with all her heart, that she had chosen a man who loved her for who she was, not for what her last name could offer. The first years of their marriage were blissful enough. Evelyn decorated their townhouse with soft colors and fresh flowers, cooking Sunday dinners and writing thank-you notes by hand. Richard threw himself into expanding his real estate empire, and Evelyn cheered him on, proud of his drive. When she discovered she was pregnant, her joy overflowed. She imagined lullabies, bedtime stories, a nursery filled with light. She imagined Richard as a devoted father, cradling their baby with tenderness. But slowly, the cracks began to show. Richard's ambition hardened into arrogance. His business trips grew longer, his temper shorter. He criticized Evelyn's small salary, reminding her that he was the true provider. He began surrounding himself with flashy colleagues and glamorous acquaintances, dismissing Evelyn's simple lifestyle as boring. She brushed it off, convinced that stress had turned him cold, that once the baby arrived, his heart would soften. Still, Evelyn carried herself with quiet strength. Even in her vulnerability, nausea, swollen feet, restless nights, she refused to let go of the dream of a loving home. She continued working at the publishing house during her pregnancy, editing manuscripts between doctors' visits, hiding the growing loneliness behind polite smiles. To her colleagues, she was radiant. To herself, she was holding on by threads of hope. Her only anchor was the child within her. She whispered to her belly at night, promising protection, promising love no matter what. "We'll be okay," she would murmur in the dark. "Mommy's here, Grandpa's here, you'll never be alone." The hospital slap shattered those illusions, but it didn't erase who Evelyn was at her core, a woman of grace, courage, and quiet resilience. She wasn't just the millionaire's humiliated wife. She was a daughter of strength, a mother in waiting, and a woman who would discover that the power she thought she lacked had been inside her all along. Richard thought she was weak because she cried softly instead of shouting, because she forgave instead of condemning. But Richard had made a fatal mistake. He mistook gentleness for powerlessness. He forgot that even the softest voices can roar when their children are threatened. And Evelyn, the trembling woman in the hospital corridor, would soon find herself at the center of a storm that would shake courtrooms and corporations alike. Because when her father Charles learned what had happened, Evelyn would no longer be standing alone. She didn't know it yet, but the slap that broke her heart would become the spark that ignited her rise. And the world was about to learn that Evelyn Grant was not a woman to be discarded. And while Richard smirked that night, convinced he had humiliated her into silence, the truth was already turning against him. The story of Evelyn Grant did not unfold in the quiet privacy of hidden places. It played out under lights so harsh they revealed every crack in the glossy surface of her husband's life. The first setting, the sterile hallways of St. Augustine Hospital, became the stage for the slap that would ripple through every corner of their world. The hospital itself was a place of healing. White walls lined with framed photographs of smiling newborns, floors polished to a reflective shine, the air humming with the steady rhythm of machines and muffled conversations. For Evelyn, it had always felt like a safe haven. Each prenatal visit was a reminder that her child was growing strong, that despite her troubles at home, there was life, hope, and promise ahead. The nurses knew her by name, offering warm smiles and gentle encouragement. The waiting room was filled with expectant mothers, exchanging quiet glances of understanding, the universal language of motherhood. But on the day Richard stormed in with Cassandra at his side, the hospital lost its peace. The sharp sound of his voice, the arrogance dripping from his words, shattered the calm like glass breaking in a church. His slap turned the maternity ward into a crime scene of humiliation, witnessed by strangers who would never forget the cruelty of a millionaire striking his pregnant wife. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene, their cameras capturing not only the slap but the smirk of Cassandra and the trembling of Evelyn. That footage, though Evelyn did not know it then, would become evidence. Proof that Richard's pride had pushed him into public violence. It would spread through whispers, social media, and finally into the courtroom where the echoes of that hospital corridor would reverberate with devastating force. After the chaos of the hospital, Evelyn returned to her father's estate. The Grant family home was not simply a residence. It was a fortress of wealth and legacy. An imposing mansion on the outskirts of Boston, surrounded by sprawling gardens and wrought iron gates. Built in the early 1900s, its stone facade carried the weight of generations, while its interiors blended old-world elegance with modern power. Charles Grant had chosen the estate as his sanctuary, but it also served as the heart of his empire. In the wood-paneled library, deals had been negotiated that shifted industries. In the marble dining hall, presidents, CEOs, and dignitaries had dined beneath crystal chandeliers. To outsiders, it was intimidating. To Evelyn, it was bittersweet. It was where her father's love had always been more duty than affection. Yet when she returned after the hospital incident, bruised and tear-stained, the estate became her shield. For the first time in years, Charles held his daughter not as a CEO, but as a father. The contrast between the hospital and the estate was stark. One a place of healing desecrated by cruelty, the other a house of power transformed into a sanctuary. In those gilded halls, Evelyn found not only protection but a renewed sense of who she was. Her father's influence was no longer distant. It was a force ready to defend her. And Richard, arrogant enough to strike her in public, had no idea the walls he was about to collide with. But the final, and perhaps most dramatic setting of Evelyn's journey was the courtroom. The Massachusetts Supreme Court building, with its towering columns and solemn air, became the arena where Richard's empire would crumble. The building itself carried gravity, a place where justice was not dressed in designer suits, but in robes of authority. The marble floors echoed with footsteps of lawyers, clerks, and witnesses. The wood benches held spectators hungry for scandal, reporters scribbling notes, and ordinary citizens curious to see a millionaire face accountability. Inside, the courtroom had its own atmosphere of power. The elevated bench where the judge presided. The long tables where attorneys prepared their weapons of words. The jury box waiting for ordinary men and women to weigh the extraordinary fall of a man who thought himself untouchable. And in the front row, sitting quietly with her hands folded over her pregnant belly, was Evelyn, a picture of grace under fire. The hospital footage played on screens for the jury. The sound of the slap echoed through the hushed courtroom, followed by Cassandra's laughter. Gasps filled the room. Richard's lawyers tried to downplay it, calling it a misunderstood gesture, but the image was undeniable. The jury didn't see a misunderstanding. They saw cruelty. They saw arrogance. They saw a man who had forgotten that money could not erase shame. Cassandra herself appeared in court, her smirk replaced with nervous fidgeting under the sharp questions of Charles Grant's legal team. She tried to paint Evelyn as weak, overdramatic, and unworthy of Richard. But the courtroom was not a hospital hallway. Here, truth mattered. And the truth was that Cassandra was a mistress who had laughed at a pregnant woman's humiliation, standing as a symbol of Richard's betrayal. The estate, too, found its place in the trial. Documents were revealed showing that Richard had attempted to leverage Evelyn's connection to her father's empire, scheming to secure contracts and insider deals. His marriage to Evelyn had not been about love, but about proximity to power. The jury learned that what Richard considered weakness was actually Evelyn's strength, her choice to live simply, to love sincerely, and to believe in people despite their flaws. Each setting, the hospital, the estate, the courtroom, wove together like chapters of a novel. The hospital revealed the cruelty. The estate revealed the strength behind Evelyn, and the courtroom revealed the reckoning. Richard had walked into St. Augustine Hospital believing he was in control. He strutted into Evelyn's life, believing she was powerless. He walked into court, believing his money and lawyers would shield him. But each place stripped him of another layer of his false power, until only the truth remained, a man who slapped his pregnant wife and lost everything because of it. Evelyn, once trembling in the hospital corridor, stood taller in each setting. At the estate, she found her father's support. In the courtroom, she found her own voice. And when the gavel finally struck, it wasn't just Richard who was judged. It was the arrogance of every man who ever believed that love could be used, that women could be broken, that motherhood was weakness. The settings of this story were not just backdrops. They were characters themselves, witnesses to cruelty, strength, and justice. And in their halls, Evelyn transformed from victim to victor. What Richard didn't realize as he sat sweating in that courtroom was that his punishment was only beginning. Every story of betrayal has its villains, and in Evelyn Grant's life, they came in the form of two people, her husband Richard and his mistress Cassandra. They weren't just antagonists in her personal story. They were the embodiment of arrogance and cruelty, two figures so wrapped in their own desires that they believed they could humiliate her without consequence. But arrogance always comes before a fall, and both Richard and Cassandra were walking blindfolded toward their own destruction. Richard Grant had spent his entire life clawing his way out of obscurity. Born into a middle-class family in Providence, he carried a chip on his shoulder the size of a skyscraper. He hated being overlooked. He despised being ordinary. While other kids were content with weekend games and family picnics, Richard spent his teenage years studying business magazines and copying the mannerisms of Wall Street titans he saw on TV. To him, success was not about passion or contribution. It was about power, control, and recognition. By the time he entered adulthood, Richard had mastered the art of pretending. He could charm a boardroom, flatter investors, and project an image of brilliance. But beneath that veneer, he was a man consumed by insecurity. His real estate deals were risky, his debts mounting, his image more fragile than anyone realized. When he married Evelyn, he didn't see a woman, he saw an opportunity. To him, she was a trophy, beautiful, gentle, and most importantly, the daughter of Charles Grant. Richard believed he had secured not only a wife, but also a permanent seat at the table of power. At first, he played the role well. Loving husband, devoted partner. But the act could only last so long. The moment Evelyn's simplicity and quiet life no longer served his hunger for prestige, he grew restless. He craved more than her gentle support. He craved admiration, lust, and validation from people who mirrored his own hunger. Enter Cassandra Moore. Cassandra was 26, ambitious, and dazzling in a way that drew attention the second she entered a room. She worked as a luxury events planner, mingling with the wealthy and powerful, always angling for her next step up the social ladder. To her, Richard was not just a lover, he was a ticket. She saw his arrogance not as a flaw, but as a tool she could manipulate. Where Evelyn offered quiet love, Cassandra offered adoration fueled by calculation. She laughed at Richard's cruel jokes, stroked his ego, and fed his belief that he deserved more than what he had. She also despised Evelyn. To Cassandra, Evelyn was everything she wasn't. Refined, respected, and legally married to the man Cassandra wanted to claim. Cassandra mocked Evelyn's modest fashion, sneering at her maternity clothes as if pregnancy was a weakness. She whispered poison into Richard's ear, convincing him that Evelyn was holding him back, that he needed to upgrade to a partner who matched his ambition. Cassandra's beauty was a mask for her venom, and she wore it proudly. Together, Richard and Cassandra became a spectacle of shamelessness. They flaunted their relationship at private parties, confident that Evelyn's quiet nature meant she would endure in silence. They underestimated her completely. Richard told himself that Evelyn was too weak to fight back, too dependent on his money, too afraid to leave. Cassandra believed Evelyn would eventually fade into the background, a forgotten wife replaced by a shinier, louder mistress. But the slap at the hospital was their fatal mistake. It wasn't just violence, it was exposure. For the first time, their arrogance was on full display, captured not only in the horrified eyes of witnesses, but also on video. And that slap revealed the core of who Richard truly was. A man so desperate for control that he would strike his pregnant wife rather than face his own insecurities. Cassandra, standing by his side, laughed at Evelyn's pain. That laugh became her undoing. In the court of public opinion, her cruelty was worse than Richard's violence. People could at least imagine anger clouding judgment, but laughter at the suffering of a pregnant woman, was unforgivable. Overnight, Cassandra transformed from glamorous mistress to public villain, her name whispered with disgust at charity galas and corporate events. Richard, meanwhile, spiraled deeper into arrogance. When Evelyn left for her father's estate, Richard sneered, convinced that she would come crawling back. He bragged to his colleagues that Charles Grant wouldn't dare cross him, that business was business and personal drama was irrelevant. He underestimated Charles the way he underestimated Evelyn, blind to the storm brewing against him. Inside, though, Richard was unraveling. His real estate empire was more fragile than he admitted. Deals were collapsing, investors were wary, and whispers of bankruptcy followed him like shadows. Instead of repairing his marriage, instead of seeking forgiveness, he doubled down on cruelty. He flaunted Cassandra in public, convinced that bravado could cover up weakness. But each step brought him closer to ruin. Cassandra, too, began to see cracks in her golden ticket. The courtroom forced her to face the reality she had laughed off. Cross-examined by Charles Grant's attorneys, she stuttered under pressure, her lies unraveling as fast as Richard's empire. The woman who once strutted into rooms with confidence now sat in the witness box, sweating under the weight of her own arrogance. They thought Evelyn was their victim, but in truth, they were victims of their own greed and pride. Richard's obsession with power blinded him to the strength of the woman he betrayed. Cassandra's hunger for status blinded her to the consequences of cruelty. Together, they were a house of cards collapsing under the weight of one slap, one laugh, and one woman's resilience. Richard and Cassandra became the perfect antagonists, not because they were clever, but because they were careless. They believed money and beauty could shield them from accountability. They believed Evelyn's gentleness was weakness. They were wrong. And as the trial drew near, their smirks faded, replaced by the dawning realization that the world they had mocked was about to bury them. And when Charles Grant finally stepped into the courtroom, Richard and Cassandra would understand what true power looked like. For weeks after the hospital incident, Evelyn Grant tried to live in the shadows of her father's estate, shielded from the whispers of society. But scandals have a way of crawling out of the dark, clawing their way into the spotlight. Richard thought he controlled the narrative. He believed he could dismiss what happened at St. Augustine Hospital as domestic tension, an exaggeration blown out of proportion. But he didn't realize how many eyes had seen the truth that day, or how many phones had captured it. It started with a single video uploaded anonymously to social media. A shaky clip filmed from across the hospital corridor showed Evelyn standing pale and trembling in her maternity gown. Richard's voice was unmistakable, sharp and cruel. "You've embarrassed me enough already." Then came the slap, loud and shocking, followed by Cassandra's laughter echoing like poison. The video was less than 30 seconds long, but it spread faster than wildfire. By morning, it was everywhere. On Twitter feeds, in online tabloids, on the front pages of gossip blogs. "Millionaire slaps pregnant wife in hospital," the headlines screamed. Outrage flooded the internet. Hashtags trended worldwide. Strangers who had never heard of Richard Grant now knew his name, his face, and his cruelty. Comment sections were filled with disgust. How could he hit his pregnant wife? She deserves better. That Mistress laughing is pure evil. The scandal didn't stop at the screen. Soon, mainstream media picked it up. Morning talk shows replayed the video with solemn faces, condemning the arrogance of the millionaire. Feminist groups rallied outside Richard's office buildings. Sponsors and partners quietly began distancing themselves from his real estate empire, pulling out of deals before the damage could tarnish them too. But Richard remained defiant. He walked into his office tower the next day wearing a tailored suit and dark sunglasses, as if he could hide from the storm. "It's all noise," he told his board of directors. "These things blow over." He even joked about the video at a private dinner with Cassandra, saying, "At least they caught my good side." Cassandra laughed, sipping champagne, but beneath the glitter of her dress, even she felt the shift. The world was not laughing with them. It was sharpening its knives. The real exposure came at the annual Midtown Charity Gala. For years, Richard had used the gala as a stage to flaunt his wealth and connections. This year, despite the scandal, he refused to step back. He arrived with Cassandra on his arm, determined to prove he was untouchable. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, champagne flowed, and photographers swarmed the red carpet. Richard posed with a smug smile, Cassandra clinging to him like a crown jewel. He believed that showing up would silence rumors, that wealth and glamour could erase shame. But as they stepped into the ballroom, the whispers began. "That's him. The one who slapped his wife. And that's the mistress who laughed." Everywhere they walked, eyes followed, filled with judgment. Investors who once shook his hand eagerly now avoided his gaze. Society women who once envied Cassandra's beauty now sneered at her. The glittering night became a cage, each chandelier light a spotlight on their disgrace. Halfway through the gala, the humiliation turned public. A journalist, bold and relentless, stood up during Richard's speech. "Mr. Grant," she called, her voice carrying through the hushed crowd. "Do you have any comment on the video of you striking your pregnant wife?" The room froze. Cameras turned. Cassandra stiffened, clutching Richard's arm. He forced a smile, his jaw twitching. "This is not the time or place for personal matters," he said, trying to wave it off. But the journalist pressed on. "So you won't deny it happened?" The crowd erupted in murmurs. Phones lifted into the air. Flashes exploded like fireworks. Richard's carefully constructed mask cracked under the weight of public judgment. He stammered, trying to regain control, but the video played in the minds of everyone in that room. His denial meant nothing. The evidence was already burned into their memories. Cassandra tried to laugh, whispering loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "People just love drama." But her voice trembled, betraying her fear. She knew the tide had turned. The glamorous mistress was no longer admired, she was despised. Meanwhile, Evelyn, though absent from the gala, became the silent star of the night. Guests whispered her name with sympathy and admiration. Poor Evelyn. Such a sweet woman, carrying his child. She deserves justice. She wasn't in the ballroom, but her presence filled it. Every glass of champagne, every nervous glance, every whispered conversation was about her. The next morning, photos from the gala flooded the news. Richard looking cornered, Cassandra's forced smile, the frozen faces of socialites caught between scandal and spectacle. Headlines screamed, "Millionaire confronted at gala over wife-slapping video." Sponsors began dropping out in waves. One by one, contracts dissolved, partnerships ended, and the empire Richard had built on arrogance began to crumble. But the exposure didn't stop there. Charles Grant, Evelyn's father, made his first public move. Known for his silence in family matters, Charles broke tradition by issuing a statement through Grant Global Industries. It was short but devastating. "Violence against women, especially those carrying the next generation, is unacceptable. My daughter and grandchild will be protected. Justice will be pursued." The world read between the lines. This wasn't just a father speaking, it was a titan declaring war. Richard had humiliated Evelyn publicly, but now he himself was the one on trial in the court of society. His mistress was mocked, his business was bleeding. His name, once synonymous with success, was now dragged through mud. What began in a sterile hospital corridor had now exploded into a scandal that reached boardrooms, newspapers, and living rooms across America. The slap was no longer a private humiliation, it was a public reckoning. Richard's arrogance had placed him at the center of a firestorm he could not control. And Cassandra, once the smirking accomplice, now found herself scorched by the same flames. And as the world turned against him, Richard didn't realize the most devastating blow was still waiting. In a courtroom, where Evelyn's father would stand face to face with the man who dared to hurt his daughter. When the scandal exploded across the media, Evelyn Grant felt the weight of the world pressing down on her fragile shoulders. For all the sympathy she received, for all the outrage directed at Richard and Cassandra, Evelyn still carried the private pain of betrayal. Every headline with her name, every replay of that video showing her humiliation, cut deeper into wounds that had not yet begun to heal. At the Grant estate, she tried to find solace in silence. The grand mansion, with its gilded ceilings and endless corridors, became both her refuge and her prison. Reporters camped outside the gates, their cameras flashing at every glimpse of her silhouette. Drones buzzed above the gardens, desperate for a shot of the pregnant wife at the center of the nation's biggest scandal. Evelyn avoided the windows, pulling curtains tight, her world shrinking into the quiet of her room. Her pregnancy, once her greatest joy, now felt shadowed by fear. She lay awake at night with her hand over her belly, whispering apologies to her unborn child. "I'm sorry you have to hear this," she murmured. "I'm sorry your father chose pride over love." Tears slid silently down her cheeks as she wondered what kind of world her baby would be born into. A world where their first memory might be of shame splashed across screens. Her father, Charles Grant, tried to comfort her in his own way. He brought her lawyers, bodyguards, and strategies, but he struggled with words of affection. His love was fierce but awkward, expressed in promises of justice rather than whispered reassurances. Evelyn appreciated his efforts, yet some nights she still felt achingly alone. She wanted her husband's hand on her back, his voice telling her everything would be okay. But that husband was gone, replaced by a man who chose violence and betrayal. The worst moment came 2 weeks after the gala. A tabloid ran a cover photo of Richard and Cassandra vacationing in the Bahamas, laughing on a yacht. The headline read, "No shame, millionaire loverbirds celebrate while pregnant wife hides." Evelyn stared at the glossy image until her vision blurred. Cassandra's arm looped around Richard's neck, her grin wide, his eyes gleaming with smug arrogance. It was as if her pain had become their triumph. That night, Evelyn broke. She sank to the floor of her room, her sobs racking her body. She clutched her belly as if holding on to the only anchor left in her storm. "Why wasn't I enough?" she whispered. The question was not for the world, not for her father, not even for Richard. It was for herself. Doubt crept in like poison. Was she too quiet, too plain, too trusting? Had her gentleness made her invisible to the man she once loved? Her breakdown frightened those around her. The estate's housekeeper, a woman who had known Evelyn since childhood, found her collapsed near the crib she had been preparing. She rushed to call Charles, who arrived within minutes. For the first time in years, the powerful CEO knelt beside his daughter, his hand trembling as he helped her to bed. "You are not weak," he said, his voice breaking. "You are my daughter. You are stronger than you know." But even those words couldn't immediately erase the shadows. For several days, Evelyn moved like a ghost. She ate little, spoke rarely, and avoided mirrors. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the hospital corridor, felt the sting of the slap, heard Cassandra's cruel laugh. Trauma replayed itself in loops, robbing her of rest. The media storm only intensified her collapse. Everywhere she turned, people had opinions about her life. Strangers called her brave, while others labeled her foolish for staying so long. Talk show hosts debated whether she should forgive or fight. Evelyn wanted to scream that she wasn't a debate topic. She was a woman trying to breathe. Her father's legal team prepared the lawsuit, but Evelyn hesitated. Part of her still clung to the memory of Richard's early tenderness, the man who once whispered to her belly about their future child. Letting go fully meant admitting he was gone forever, and that reality was almost unbearable. Her breakdown reached a dangerous low one stormy night. Rain lashed against the mansion's windows as Evelyn wandered into the nursery she had been preparing months earlier. Soft blue curtains framed the crib, stuffed animals lined the shelves, and a rocking chair sat in the corner waiting for lullabies. She lowered herself into the chair, clutching a tiny baby blanket. In the dim light, she whispered, "I don't know if I can do this alone." For hours, she rocked in silence, the storm outside echoing the storm inside her. But then, as dawn broke and the rain softened, she felt a gentle kick from within her belly. Her baby was alive, strong, refusing to be silenced. Evelyn placed her hand over the movement, tears streaming anew, but this time they were different. The baby was a reminder that she wasn't truly alone. She carried within her the very reason to keep fighting. It was the first crack of light in her darkness. Evelyn realized she couldn't let Richard's cruelty define her or her child's future. She couldn't stay collapsed on the floor while the world watched. If she gave up now, Richard and Cassandra would win. And worse, her baby would inherit a story of defeat instead of resilience. Slowly, Evelyn began to rise. She agreed to meet with her father's lawyers. She allowed the estate staff to care for her needs. She started journaling, writing letters to her unborn child, promising them a better life. Her breakdown had stripped her raw, but it also revealed the depths of her strength. Her collapse wasn't the end of her story, it was the turning point. Like the heroes of the children's books she once edited, Evelyn was discovering that even the gentlest characters could face dragons. And Richard, with his arrogance, and Cassandra, with her laughter, were about to learn that the woman they had mocked was far stronger than they ever imagined. And when Evelyn finally found her voice again, it would shake the very foundations of Richard's empire. When Evelyn finally agreed to step into the courtroom, she carried not only the bruises of betrayal, but also the quiet strength that had begun to bloom within her. She wasn't walking in alone. At her side was Charles Grant, the man the business world had long called a titan. For years, Evelyn had kept her distance from her father's ruthless empire, preferring a quieter life. But now, that empire was hers to lean on, and Charles was no longer just the CEO of Grant Global. He was the father who had sworn to protect his daughter and unborn grandchild at any cost. The courthouse was packed the morning of the trial. Reporters jostled for position on the steps, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing like lightning. Will Mr. Grant testify? Is it true there's evidence of fraud? What does Evelyn want in the divorce settlement? The questions swirled, but Charles walked through the chaos with a calm that unnerved even seasoned journalists. Beside him, Evelyn moved slowly, her hand resting on her belly, her face pale but determined. Richard arrived minutes later with Cassandra, both dressed as if it were a red carpet event. He wore a custom suit, his chin lifted in defiance. Cassandra clung to his arm, her lips painted in a smug smile. To the flashing cameras, they looked untouchable. as though wealth and bravado could erase the slap that still burned across the nation's memory. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Evelyn sat quietly at her table, her lawyers prepared with stacks of evidence. Across the aisle, Richard's team oozed confidence. His lead attorney, a slick man with a reputation for bending the truth, whispered promises of victory. Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking at Evelyn as if to say, "You'll regret crossing me." But then the proceedings began, and the tide shifted. The prosecution opened with the hospital footage. The slap echoed through the hushed chamber, followed by Cassandra's unmistakable laugh. The jury flinched. Richard's lawyer objected, claiming the video was taken out of context, but the judge overruled. "The evidence speaks for itself," she said firmly. Already Richard's mask began to crack. Next came witnesses. Nurses testified to Evelyn's trembling after the slap. A security guard recalled Cassandra's cruel laughter. Each word carved deeper into Richard's credibility. Still, he held his arrogance like armor, whispering under his breath to Cassandra, "They can't touch me. I'll walk out of here richer than ever." But he hadn't counted on Charles Grant. Halfway through the trial, Evelyn's father rose from his seat. The courtroom stilled. The judge recognized him immediately. "Mr. Grant, you wish to testify?" Charles adjusted his tie and stepped to the stand. His voice, deep and steady, carried authority that needed no amplification. "I am not here simply as a CEO," he began. "I am here as a father whose daughter was humiliated, struck, and laughed at while carrying my grandchild." He paused, his gaze fixed on Richard. "But I am also here with evidence that this man is not just abusive, he is a fraud." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Richard shifted uneasily in his chair. Charles continued. "Over the past several months, my investigators uncovered documents showing Mr. Grant has been embezzling funds from his investors. He has forged signatures, falsified reports, and funneled money into shell companies under Miss Cassandra Moore's name." He gestured toward Cassandra, whose painted smile faltered instantly. "This is not a husband protecting his family. This is a con man using arrogance as a disguise." The judge leaned forward. "Do you have proof, Mr. Grant?" Charles nodded to his attorney, who presented a thick binder of documents. Bank records, emails, contracts with forged signatures. The evidence was overwhelming. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge flipped through the pages. Richard's face drained of color. Cassandra's hand slipped from his arm, her eyes wide with panic. Richard's lawyer jumped to his feet, sputtering objections. "This is irrelevant to the divorce proceedings." The judge cut him off sharply. "Fraud and abuse are very relevant when determining custody, settlements, and criminal liability." Her gavel struck once. "Proceed." Evelyn watched as the empire Richard had boasted about began to collapse in real time. Every arrogant word, every cruel act, every slap and sneer was now overshadowed by the truth. He wasn't just abusive, he was corrupt. His wealth was built on lies, and now those lies were unraveling before everyone. Cassandra broke first. Under cross-examination, she admitted that Richard had pressured her into signing documents, promising her a share of his empire. Her confidence crumbled as she realized she might face charges herself. "I didn't know it was illegal," she stammered, her voice trembling. The jury didn't believe her. The spectators shook their heads in disgust. The glamorous mistress who once laughed at Evelyn's pain was now reduced to tears, her reputation shattered. Richard's downfall was complete when Charles revealed one final twist. "Mr. Grant," he said coldly, "did you forget about the prenuptial agreement you signed?" Richard blinked, confused. "What agreement? There was no." Charles's attorney handed a document to the judge. Evelyn gasped softly when she saw it. She had forgotten too, but her father hadn't. Years ago, when she first considered marrying Richard, Charles had insisted on a protective clause, hidden in plain sight, signed in Richard's eagerness to marry into the family. The prenup stated that in the event of abuse or infidelity, Evelyn would receive full control of all marital assets, leaving Richard with nothing. The judge read it aloud. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Richard's face twisted in rage. "This is impossible. I destroyed it," he shouted. Charles's calm reply cut through the noise. "You may have destroyed your copy, but I always keep mine." It was the killing blow. Richard's empire, his fortune, his reputation, all of it slipped through his fingers in that single moment. Evelyn, the woman he once mocked as weak, now sat quietly with everything. The trial ended with a decisive ruling. Evelyn was granted full custody of her unborn child, sole ownership of Richard's assets under the prenup, and the court referred Richard's fraud to federal investigators. Cassandra, implicated in the schemes, faced her own legal battles. As the gavel struck for the final time, Richard slumped in his chair, his arrogance finally broken. Cassandra wept silently beside him. Meanwhile, Evelyn held her father's hand, her eyes glistening not with tears of pain, but with relief. The twist was not just that her father had saved her, it was that she had been stronger all along. Charles gave her the weapons, but Evelyn was the one who stood tall in the storm. And when the cameras flashed outside the courthouse, the world saw not a victim, but a woman who had risen from humiliation to victory, ready to begin again. The courthouse steps were flooded with cameras, but when Evelyn Grant walked out, she no longer looked like the fragile woman in a hospital gown. She wore a tailored, navy dress that draped elegantly over her pregnant belly, her hair pulled back in a sleek style that revealed the strength in her features. The sun caught the silver necklace at her throat, a gift from her late mother, which sparkled as if to remind her that resilience ran in her blood. The world leaned in to see her. She was no longer the slapped wife or the pregnant victim. She was the woman who had faced betrayal, endured public humiliation, and emerged victorious. And with her father at her side, she looked untouchable. Reporters shouted questions. "Evelyn, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you forgive your husband? What will you do with control of his assets?" Evelyn paused at the microphones, her hand resting gently on her belly. Her voice was calm, steady, and resolute. "I did not ask for this fight," she said. "But when you are struck, when you are humiliated, you have a choice, to stay silent or to stand. I stood, not just for myself, but for my child. No woman deserves to be treated as disposable. No child deserves to inherit a legacy of cruelty. Today, the court has shown that power, money, and arrogance cannot shield you from justice. I will build a new life, not on Richard's lies, but on truth, dignity, and love." The crowd erupted in applause. For the first time, Evelyn smiled, not the polite smile she once wore at Richard's side, but a genuine smile born of strength reclaimed. That night, Evelyn returned to the Grant estate, but she didn't retreat into hiding. She met with her father's board members and made a surprising announcement. Though she had never sought power, Evelyn would take temporary stewardship of the marital assets awarded to her in court. "These properties, these accounts, they were built on deceit," she said. "But they will now be used for good. I plan to create the Grant Foundation for Women and Children, providing shelters, education, and legal aid for those who cannot fight alone." Her father, known for his cold boardroom strategies, watched with pride as his daughter commanded the room with grace. It was not his voice that silenced the directors. It was hers. In that moment, Evelyn transformed from the quiet editor of children's books into a leader in her own right. Meanwhile, Richard's fall was merciless. His assets stripped, his fraud under federal investigation, and his mistress testifying against him. He found himself abandoned by the very people who once clamored for his attention. Invitations to galas vanished. Investors fled. His office tower, once a symbol of his pride, was repossessed. And in the tabloids, the images of him leaving court with a scowl became the new face of disgrace. Cassandra fared no better. The glamorous mistress became a pariah. Branded as a co-conspirator and the woman who laughed at Evelyn's pain, she lost her career, her reputation, and her social standing. Once she had strutted through charity events in designer gowns, now she avoided cameras, her name forever tied to scandal. The world had turned its back on her as swiftly as she had turned her back on Evelyn's humanity. But Evelyn didn't waste energy on revenge. Her greatest triumph was not Richard's downfall or Cassandra's humiliation. Her triumph was survival, transformed into strength, dignity, and a future she controlled. Months later, Evelyn gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The press waited outside the hospital, but this time the scene was different. There was no slap, no cruelty, no humiliation. There was only joy. Charles Grant cradled his grandson with tears in his eyes, whispering, "Welcome to a better world, little one." Evelyn named her son Alexander, after her late mother's favorite character in a children's story. She held him close, whispering promises of love, safety, and a life free from the shadows of betrayal. The world, once cruel and unforgiving, seemed to soften in that moment. The scandal had begun in a hospital with pain and humiliation, but it ended in a hospital with new life and hope. The transformation was complete. Evelyn had gone from victim to victor, from silence to voice, from humiliation to inspiration. And her story became more than just a scandal. It became a warning and a beacon. Months after the trial, Evelyn stood on a stage at the launch of the Grant Foundation. Survivors of domestic abuse sat in the audience, some clutching their children, others holding back tears. Evelyn spoke with the same steady calm she had found in court. "I was told I was weak," she said. "I was told that silence was my only option. But I am here to tell you, gentleness is not weakness. Tears are not failure, and motherhood is not a burden. We are stronger than the cruelty we endure. We are more powerful than the people who try to break us. I stand here not just as Evelyn Grant, but as proof that no woman, no mother, no daughter has to accept humiliation as her fate." The crowd rose to its feet in thunderous applause. Survivors embraced, tears of recognition flowing freely. Reporters captured the moment, headlines the next day proclaiming, "From betrayal to triumph, Evelyn Grant inspires a nation." As Evelyn stepped off the stage, her father met her with a rare smile. "You've built something greater than I ever could," he told her. For once, he wasn't the titan of industry, he was just a proud father. That night, Evelyn rocked her baby to sleep, the glow of the city lights filtering through the curtains. She whispered, "We made it, Alex. We turned pain into power." The child stirred softly, and Evelyn smiled, knowing that their future was no longer shadowed by Richard's cruelty. For Richard, arrogance had been his downfall. For Cassandra, cruelty had been her mask. But for Evelyn, love and resilience had been her salvation. Her story closed not with revenge, but with justice and renewal. And for every woman watching, for every mother who had felt weak, Evelyn's journey became a reminder. You are never powerless, you are never voiceless, and your strength will always outlast the arrogance of those who try to break you. So, that's where the story closes. And if you're still here with me right now, it means something in this journey touched your heart. Maybe you've been through betrayal. Maybe you've carried pain and silence. But remember what Marcus Aurelius once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength. Evelyn's story isn't just about revenge. It's about rising again, choosing dignity over despair, and protecting what truly matters. Life will test us, but it can never take away the power of how we choose to respond. And maybe, just maybe, this story is your reminder that you are stronger than you think. If this resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so we can keep walking through these stories together. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.